By the fourth night of a storm that would later be called the 9-day whiteout, a family walked out into weather that could kill a person in 20 minutes, feeling their way along a rope strung between two houses because the fire in their own home had already died. They were walking toward the one house in the valley everyone had laughed at 3 months earlier for wasting good straw on something as strange as a wall. Tonight, that house was the only one still warm.
There is a particular kind of devastation that only love can create, and no other force in the world can quite manage. War can destroy a city. A plague can empty it. But only love, betrayed completely, can turn a woman who once gave up her home, her family, and her own conscience for a man into the architect of his total and permanent ruin. Tonight we are going to follow the story of a woman who did exactly that. A princess and a sorceress who helped a foreign hero win the impossible, who sacrificed everything her old life meant to follow him, and who, when he finally discarded her for something more convenient, answered that betrayal with an act so terrible it has echoed through 3,000 years of telling and retelling. This is not, in the end, a story about a monster. It is a story about what love can become when it is allowed to curdle all the way through, with nothing left to soften the fall. To understand how far she was willing to go, we must go back to the very beginning, to a distant kingdom at the edge of the known world, and to the moment a foreign ship first appeared on its shore. The kingdom was Colchis, a rich and remote land on the far eastern edge of the Black Sea, ruled by a king named Aeetes, a son of the sun god Helios himself. It was to this kingdom that the Golden Fleece had been carried generations before, and it was here that the hero Jason and his band of Argonauts sailed, seeking to claim it and carry it home to Greece. But the fleece was guarded fiercely, hung upon a sacred tree, and watched over by a serpent that never closed its eyes, and King Aeetes had no intention of simply handing over the greatest treasure in his kingdom to a shipload of foreign strangers. He set Jason a task that was designed, quite deliberately, to be impossible to survive. Yoke 2 monstrous bulls with hooves of bronze and breath of fire, plow a field with them, sow it with the teeth of a dragon, and then defeat the army of armed warriors that would spring up, fully grown, from the furrows. No mortal had ever completed such a task and lived. King Aeetes announced the terms to Jason and his crew with the calm, almost bored confidence of a man who had watched many ambitious strangers arrive at his court over the years and had buried every single one of them. He did not expect this golden-haired Greek to be any different. What he did not know, and could not have accounted for in any of his calculations, was that his own daughter was about to fall in love with the stranger before the sun set that same day. It was in the halls of that palace, watching this confident foreign stranger prepare to walk knowingly into his own death, that a young princess of Colchis first laid eyes on Jason and felt something shift irreversibly inside her. Her name was Medea, which means in the Old Greek something close to cunning or clever counsel, a name that would prove, across the whole span of her life, to be less a description than a prophecy, and she was no ordinary princess. She was a granddaughter of the sun god himself, a priestess of the dark goddess Hecate, and already, though still young, a sorceress of formidable and unsettling power, trained in potions and spells that could heal or curse with equal ease. From childhood she had walked the dark groves sacred to Hecate, learning the properties of roots pulled at midnight and the words that could calm a wound or poison a well with equal certainty, and by the time she was old enough to be noticed at her father's court, she was already whispered about not merely as a clever princess, but as a woman whose favor or whose anger could reshape a person's fate entirely. She had never yet had reason to turn that power against someone she loved. That, too, was about to change. The old poets are careful to tell us that this sudden, overwhelming love was not entirely her own doing, that the goddess Hera, still watching over Jason from his earlier adventures, asked Aphrodite to have her son Eros strike the girl with one of his arrows, ensuring her heart would be bound to the hero the moment she saw him. Whether this was fate imposed from outside or simply the ordinary lightning of first love, striking a young woman who had never before been asked to feel anything so large, the result was the same. Medea was lost to him completely, before he had even spoken a single word to her. She is said to have lain awake that whole first night, torn between the family duty that had shaped her entire life and a longing for a stranger she had exchanged not a single sentence with, weeping at the unfairness of a heart that could be so completely claimed by someone she barely knew existed only hours before. It was, in every sense, the least rational decision of her life. It would also prove to be the one decision from which every other choice in this story would inevitably follow. Jason, for his part, seems to have accepted her help that first night with the easy confidence of a man used to being saved by circumstance, without pausing to weigh what it might one day cost the woman offering it. He was charming and grateful and utterly persuasive in the way that desperate men so often become when their own survival depends on someone else's goodwill. And Medea, young and inexperienced in matters of the heart despite all her mastery of darker crafts, had no defense at all against a charm aimed so precisely at the one vulnerability she had never had reason to guard. It is worth pausing on this detail, because it will matter enormously by the end of this story. Medea's love did not grow slowly, tested by time and shared hardship. It arrived all at once, total and overwhelming, in the presence of a stranger she barely knew, and it demanded of her almost immediately an impossible choice between the family she had always belonged to and the man she had just met. That a love beginning with such sudden, consuming intensity might also, one day, curdle with equally sudden and consuming intensity is a warning the story plants, here, quietly, long before the tragedy itself arrives. Medea came to Jason in secret, and she made him a bargain that would define the rest of both their lives. She would use her powers to help him survive her father's impossible trial, and in return she asked only one thing, that he take her with him when he sailed for Greece, and that he swear by every god who might hold him to it, to make her his wife and never abandon her. Jason, desperate and with no other hope of surviving the ordeal ahead, swore the oath eagerly and meant it in that moment with his whole heart. And so Medea gave him a magical ointment to protect his skin from the bull's fire and the bronze of their hooves, and taught him a trick to defeat the earthborn warriors: to throw a single stone into the midst of the sprouting army, so that they would turn on one another in confusion, each blaming his neighbor for the blow, and destroy themselves without Jason ever needing to lift his sword against the whole host at once. On the morning of the trial, the whole court of Colchis gathered to watch what they assumed would be a brief and brutal spectacle. The bronze-hooved bulls were led out snorting flame, and Jason, his skin already anointed in secret with Medea's protective ointment, walked toward them without so much as a flinch, to the visible astonishment of everyone watching who did not know his secret. He seized the bulls by their horns, wrestled them to the yoke, the crowd gasping as fire licked harmlessly across skin that should have blistered and burned, unaware that the true miracle they were watching had been brewed the night before in a young woman's private chamber, from herbs no man in that court would have known how to name, and drove the plow through the stony field himself. And when the dragon's teeth were sown into the furrows, and the armed warriors began to rise, fully grown from the earth, spears already in hand, Jason did exactly as Medea had instructed. He hurled a single stone into their confused, half-formed ranks, and watched as the earth-born men turned on one another in blind fury, mistaking each other for the source of the blow, until every last one of them lay dead by a fellow warrior's hand rather than by his own. Jason completed the trial exactly as she had taught him, and Colchis watched in stunned disbelief as the impossible task was done. But King Aeetes, furious and humiliated, had no intention of honoring his half of the bargain and letting the fleece go. And it was here that Medea made the first of the truly irreversible choices that would define her, choices that made returning to her old life and her old self forever impossible. She went by night to the sacred grove where the fleece hung, and using her knowledge of herbs and spells, she sang the ever-watchful serpent into a deep and unnatural sleep. The great serpent, which had not closed its eyes in living memory, sank slowly to the ground beneath the sacred tree as Medea's low, unbroken song wound through the dark grove, and Jason, watching a creature no weapon could ever have defeated, simply fall into a dreaming stillness at the sound of a woman's voice, must have understood then, if he had not fully understood it before, exactly how far beyond ordinary help his survival depended on her. And Jason took the golden fleece from the tree with his own hands. There would be no explaining this away to her father in the morning. Medea had chosen, completely and finally, the side of a foreign stranger over her own family and her own kingdom, knowing her father would pursue them without mercy. Once the theft and her own betrayal were discovered, Medea did not merely flee. She took her own younger brother Apsyrtus with her onto the ship, and as her father's fleet closed in upon them at sea, she committed an act so cold and so calculated that even the old poets, who rarely flinched from violence, told it with a kind of hushed horror. She killed her brother and cut his body into pieces, and scattered the pieces across the water behind their fleeing ship, knowing that her grieving father would be forced to stop and gather each piece of his son for proper burial, unable to bear leaving even one fragment of his child unburied in the waves, and that this terrible task would cost him the time he needed to catch them. It worked exactly as she had calculated. Aeetes fell behind, gathering the scattered pieces of his own son from the sea. Some of the old tellings place this act slightly differently. The boy already aboard the pursuing fleet, rather than her own ship, lured across under some pretense and killed before her father's very eyes on the water. But every version agrees on the two facts that matter most, that Apsyrtus died at Medea's hand, or by her design, and that his death and her father's grief-stricken need to gather every fragment of him was precisely what let Jason's ship escape, and Jason's ship sailed on free toward Greece. We should sit with this moment longer than the old tellings usually allow us to, because it is the true hinge of this entire story. Medea did not merely disobey her father. She did not merely steal a treasure. She murdered her own brother and desecrated his body, calculating with cold precision exactly how a grieving parent's love would slow his pursuit, using the very bond of family devotion as a weapon against her own family. It was an act of a mind capable of treating even the most sacred human bonds as instruments, to be used however necessity demanded, if the cause was great enough. And the cause in this case was simply Jason. Already, long before any betrayal on his part, Medea had shown the world exactly what she was capable of doing in the name of a love only weeks old. It is worth remembering this later, when the story asks whether her final and most terrible act was truly born only from Jason's betrayal, or whether it had in fact always been somewhere inside her, waiting. Even Jason, watching her that day on the deck of his own ship, is said to have gone pale and silent, understanding, for the first time, exactly what kind of woman he had bound his fate to, and choosing, all the same, to sail on with her, to accept the gift of his own survival without asking too closely what it had cost. That, too, is worth remembering later. He knew, from nearly the very beginning, precisely what she was capable of, and he took her as his wife regardless. The voyage home was long, and it was not without its own dangers. Storms that scattered their course, monsters along unfamiliar shores, the constant fear that Medea's father might yet send some fresh pursuit after them across the sea. Through all of it, the crew of the Argo came to rely on Medea's knowledge as much as Jason's leadership, though the old poets note a growing unease among some of the older sailors, who had begun to wonder, quietly among themselves, exactly what kind of woman their captain had chosen to bind his fortune to. Jason returned to his homeland of Iolcus with the Golden Fleece at last, only to find that his uncle Pelias, who had sent him on the quest in the first place, hoping he would never return, had no intention of honoring his own promise to surrender the throne. And once again, it was Medea's cunning, not Jason's strength, that solved the problem, though this time in a manner even darker than before. She approached Pelias's own daughters, who loved their aging father, and longed to see him young and strong again, and she offered them a demonstration of her powers. She led them to a quiet courtyard, away from the eyes of the palace guard, and there, with the calm confidence of a woman entirely certain of her own craft, she took an old and worn-out ram, cut it into pieces before their disbelieving eyes, placed the pieces in a boiling cauldron with certain secret herbs murmured over, in a language none of them recognized, and drew out from that same cauldron, to the daughters' astonished joy, a young, living lamb, bleeding and whole, restored entirely to youth. Convinced by what they had witnessed, Pelias' own daughters were persuaded to do the same to their father, believing they were about to grant him a new and youthful life. They cut him into pieces and placed him in the cauldron themselves. But this time, Medea withheld the final herbs that would have completed the miracle, and Pelias did not rise again. His own daughters, loving him more than anything, had killed him with their own hands, deceived entirely by a woman who had never once needed to lift a blade herself. The daughters, when the truth of what they had done finally broke over them, are said to have fled Iolcus in horror and shame, unable to remain in a city that had watched them murder their own beloved father with their own trusting hands. Medea, watching from a safe distance, felt no need to explain herself to anyone. The throne in the end was simply cleared for Jason, exactly as she had promised it would be. And once again, no one could ever quite prove her hand had been the one that struck the fatal blow. It is a pattern by now that should be impossible to miss. Every triumph Jason won on this journey, the trial of the bulls, the theft of the fleece, even his own uncle's throne, was, in truth, Medea's victory, achieved through her power, her cunning, and her willingness to do whatever the moment required, however cold or however cruel. Jason was the hero the stories remembered. Medea was the reason he survived long enough to be remembered at all. And it is against this backdrop, a woman who had given up her family, her homeland, her own hands clean of blood, entirely for this one man's sake, that the true tragedy of this story must be measured. For all her power, the murder of Pelias made Iolcus impossible for them to remain in. And Jason and Medea went into exile together, eventually settling in the city of Corinth. And here, for a time, the story grows quiet, in exactly the way that happy years so often do in the old tellings, not because nothing happened, but because nothing happened that needed remembering. Medea bore Jason 2 sons. They built a household together. Years passed in the ordinary rhythm of a marriage, and whatever darkness Medea had shown the world on the road from Colchis seemed, for a decade or more, to have settled into the quiet, ordinary devotion of a wife and mother. It is important to hold on to this picture of quiet domestic peace for a moment, because it makes what follows so much harder to bear. This was never a marriage built on convenience alone. 2 children had been born from it. An entire decade of ordinary life had been lived inside it. She learned the local customs, the local gods, the local rhythms of a city that had never asked for her and never fully welcomed her either. And she raised her sons to speak the language of their father's homeland fluently, even as her own accent, the old tellings note, never quite lost the trace of the distant eastern court she had abandoned everything to leave behind. Neighbors in Corinth, the old accounts suggest, grew accustomed to the sight of the foreign queen at the market, at the well, at the small ordinary errands of a mother, raising 2 boys in a city that was not her own. And if they ever remembered the darker rumors that had followed her from Colchis and from Iolcus, the passing years of quiet domesticity seemed, for a while, to answer those rumors more convincingly than any denial could have. But ambition in this story proves itself a more patient and more corrosive force than any sorcery Medea ever commanded. Jason, growing restless in exile and increasingly aware that a foreign wife, however powerful, offered him no path to real standing in Greek society, began to look elsewhere. King Creon of Corinth had a daughter, a young princess named Glauce, and Creon offered Jason her hand in marriage, a match that would secure Jason's own future, elevate his standing considerably, and grant him a legitimate place in a great Greek royal house, something a foreign sorceress wife, however loyal, could never provide him. And Jason, weighing his own advancement against a decade of devotion and 2 living sons, made his choice. It was not a decision made in a single reckless moment. Jason weighed it, the old plays make clear, with the same careful, self-interested calculation he had once relied on Medea to supply for him, measuring what a decade of loyal marriage to a foreign sorceress could offer him against what a single royal wedding to a Corinthian princess might secure for the rest of his life, and finding in the cold arithmetic of ambition that the woman who had given him everything simply weighed less than the throne he still wanted. He told himself, in the way ambitious men so often do, that he was still the same grateful husband he had always been. That circumstance alone was forcing his hand, and that a wiser, more practical wife would surely understand the necessity of it, if only she would stop to think as clearly as he believed himself to be thinking. He would set Medea aside and marry the princess of Corinth instead. What makes this betrayal so much crueler than an ordinary abandonment is the reasoning Jason offered for it, which the old plays preserve almost word for word, because its cold logic was itself part of the horror. He did not claim he no longer loved her, or that some new passion had overtaken him. He argued, instead, that this marriage was actually a kindness to her and to their sons, that by marrying into Corinthian royalty, he could secure a better, safer future for the very children he was abandoning their mother to obtain it. He asked her, in effect, to be grateful for her own replacement. It is one thing to be left for someone else. It is another thing entirely to be told that your own devastation is, properly understood, a generous gift being given to you. Medea, hearing this reasoning laid out to her calmly, as though it were simply good household planning, rather than the destruction of everything she had sacrificed to build, is said to have gone very quiet. A silence that those who knew her, including Jason himself, ought to have found far more alarming than any outburst of grief or fury. King Creon, fearing, with good reason, given everything we have already seen her capable of, exactly what a scorned and humiliated Medea might do, ordered her banished from Corinth immediately, along with her sons, to remove any danger before the wedding could even take place. And it was here, stripped of her marriage, her home, and now facing exile once again in a foreign land, with 2 young children and nowhere certain to go, that something in Medea, which had perhaps always been coiled and waiting, since the day she cut her own brother into pieces on the deck of a fleeing ship, finally came fully undone. She begged Creon for a single day's delay before her exile, claiming she needed only that much time to prepare for the journey with her sons. Creon, moved by pity, or perhaps simply eager to be rid of the confrontation without further scenes, granted it. Creon, it is worth noting, was not a foolish or careless king. He had heard the rumors that followed Medea from Colchis and from Iolcus, and he had made his decision to exile her precisely because he feared exactly this kind of retaliation. His single lapse, a single day's mercy, granted to a mother who claimed she only wished time to prepare her sons for the road, would prove the most catastrophic misjudgment of his entire reign. It was, in hindsight, the most catastrophic mercy in the entire story. For Medea did not use that day to pack for a journey. She used it to plan a revenge so complete and so carefully calibrated to inflict the maximum possible suffering that it would ensure Jason lost absolutely everything that had ever mattered to him in a single, unbearable stroke. She spent that stolen day, the old accounts tell us, moving through her own household with an eerie, deliberate calm, gathering herbs and ingredients she had likely kept prepared for years, without ever expecting to need them, as though some quiet, watchful part of her had always suspected this day might eventually come, however happy the preceding decade had seemed. Her first act of vengeance was aimed at the woman who had replaced her. Medea prepared a beautiful golden robe and an ornate golden crown, poisoned with a substance of her own devising, and she sent her own 2 sons to deliver these gifts to the young Princess Glauce, dressed as a peace offering, a gesture, it seemed, of gracious acceptance from a defeated rival. Glauce, delighted with such fine gifts, put them on at once, and the poison did its work with horrifying speed and violence, the old plays tell us, consuming her in flame the moment the golden fabric touched her skin. When her father, King Creon, rushed to her side and embraced his dying daughter in his grief, the poison spread to him as well, and father and daughter died together, locked in the same fatal embrace. In a single stroke, Medea had destroyed the entire royal house that had welcomed Jason's betrayal, the new bride, and the king who had arranged the marriage and ordered her own exile, both gone. The whole of Corinth, by nightfall, was in an uproar of grief and terror, and messengers were already racing to warn Jason, before the sorceress could turn her attention to anything or anyone else he still held dear. Word of it reached the palace in a single frantic messenger's account, gasped out to a stunned household. The golden robe, bursting suddenly into unnatural flame the instant it touched Gloss's skin. The young princess, screaming and tearing at the fabric that would not release her, and her father, arriving moments later and unable to bear the sight of his daughter's suffering, gathering her into his arms only to be claimed by the very same fire, so that by the time anyone thought to intervene, both were already beyond any help at all. It should have ended there. A grieving father and a poisoned bride would have been, by any ordinary measure, revenge enough for any betrayed wife in all of Greek myth. But Medea's calculation went one terrible step further, and it is this final act, more than any other in her entire story, that has made her name a byword for the darkest extremity of vengeance for 3,000 years. She understood something about Jason with a clarity that must have come from a decade of watching him closely, loving him closely, knowing exactly what he valued most in all the world. His new bride was gone, yes, and his path to Corinthian power along with her. But Jason still had his sons. He still had a future carried forward in their names, a legacy that would outlast every betrayal and every scandal. Whatever else the world took from him this day, his sons remained his, proof that some part of him, however diminished, would continue on into the future he had schemed so carefully to secure. And Medea understood, with a coldness that the old poets themselves seemed almost afraid to look at directly, that as long as Jason still had his sons, he had not yet lost everything. We will not linger here on the details of what she did next. In the same way, the old plays themselves chose restraint over spectacle at this exact moment. The most sacred rule of Greek tragedy was that the worst violence always happened off-stage, unseen, reported afterward by a horrified messenger, rather than shown directly. What matters, and what the story insists we sit with, is the terrible weight of the choice itself, and the anguish that the old poets tell us came with it. Medea did not act without a struggle. Even in her fury, even in her total commitment to Jason's ruin, she is shown wavering, torn between the love of a mother for the children she had carried and raised, and the burning need to make the man who had discarded her feel a devastation equal to her own. She is shown speaking to them tenderly in her private chamber, even as she steadies herself for what she has already decided to do, holding their small hands, memorizing, perhaps, the exact weight and warmth of them one final time, before the resolve that had carried her across an ocean and through a decade of exile, hardened once more into something no plea, not even her own children's, could soften. In the end, her fury for Jason's suffering outweighed even her love for her own sons, and she took both their lives with her own hands, so that Jason's line, his future, and everything he had hoped to build on the ruins of their marriage would end with her. There is no comfort to be offered here, and the old plays never once tried to manufacture any. No last-minute rescue, no change of heart arriving in time, no mercy granted by any god watching from above. The tragedy is allowed to complete itself exactly as it was always heading, because the whole and terrible point of the story is that some betrayals cannot be answered halfway. When Jason arrived, too late, having learned of Creon and Gloss's deaths, and racing home in terror for his son's safety, he found Medea already beyond his reach, risen above the palace, in a chariot, drawn by winged dragons. A final gift, the old stories tell us, from her grandfather the sun god, sent to carry his granddaughter to safety, no matter what she had done. From that impossible height, safe from any vengeance Jason might have wished to take, Medea looked down at the man for whom she had betrayed. Her father murdered her own brother, destroyed a king, and finally killed her own children, and she felt, by every account that survives, no remorse that history has recorded. She had done what she set out to do. Jason was left with nothing at all, no bride, no throne, no sons, no future. Alive, but utterly and permanently ruined, exactly as she had calculated he should be. He raged at her from the ground below, the old plays tell us, demanding at least the mercy of burying his own sons with his own hands, a final plea for some small fragment of ordinary human decency to survive amid the ruin. Even this, Medea refused him, carrying their bodies away with her into her exile, so that Jason would be denied even the small comfort of a grave to grieve beside. Jason's own ending, in the years that followed, carries its own quiet, almost gentle cruelty, entirely without the theatrics of Medea's revenge. Stripped of everything, he wandered, aged and forgotten, and one day, the old stories tell us, he came to rest in the shade of his own ship, the Argo, the very vessel that had once carried him to glory and to Medea both, now old and rotting on the shore where it had been dragged up out of the water years before. As he sat beneath it, remembering perhaps everything he had won and everything he had thrown away, a beam of the decaying hull broke loose above him and fell, killing him instantly, crushed beneath the wreck of his own former triumph. No enemy sought him out. No god struck him down in open fury. He simply grew old, alone, stripped of the golden fleece he had once carried home in glory, stripped of the wife who had won it for him, stripped of the sons who might have carried his name forward, until even the ship that first made him famous grew too rotten to bear its own weight above his head. There is no more thorough a punishment in all of Greek myth than to simply be left alive, entirely forgotten, until the past itself finally collapses on top of you. It is difficult not to hear, in that quiet ending, the same cold calculation that shaped everything Medea ever did, that a man who built his glory on a woman's sacrifice should, in the end, be destroyed by the very ship that carried the proof of it. And so we return, at the very end, to the question this whole story was built to ask. Was Medea always a monster, simply waiting for the right provocation to reveal herself? Or did an ordinary woman, capable of extraordinary love, become something monstrous only because of what was done to her? The honest answer, the one the old Greek tragedians seemed most interested in forcing their audiences to sit with, is more uncomfortable than either simple explanation. The capacity for that final, devastating cruelty was there from the very beginning, visible already in the murder of her own brother, long before Jason ever wronged her at all. But it was Jason's betrayal and Creon's cruelty and the world's casual assumption that a woman who had given everything could simply be discarded once she was no longer useful, that gave that waiting capacity its final target and its final justification. It is worth asking, too, what might have happened had Jason simply kept his oath, had he honored the decade of loyalty and sacrifice Medea had given him, rather than weighing her against a more convenient crown. The story offers no answer to this, because the tragedy depends on the fact that he did not, and could not, imagine that the woman who had already killed for him might one day be willing to destroy everything alongside him as well. Medea was never innocent, but she was also never given a single reason. across the entire span of this story, to believe that the world owed her anything but betrayal in return for her devotion. The playwrights of Athens, when they staged this story for audiences who already knew every twist of it by heart, chose deliberately to end not on the spectacle of the murders themselves, but on that final image of Medea rising up out of reach in her dragon-drawn chariot, safe, unpunished, and entirely beyond the ordinary justice a Greek audience would have expected to see restored by the final curtain. It was, in its own time, a deeply unsettling choice, precisely because it refused its audience the comfort of watching wickedness punished. That, perhaps, is the coldest truth this story still has to offer, 3,000 years later. Love given completely, without reservation, does not always transform the person who receives it into someone worthy of it. And a love that is betrayed completely enough by someone who never once imagined the full cost of what they were discarding does not simply fade away quietly into grief. Sometimes, in the oldest and darkest of these old stories, it turns and it remembers every single thing it once sacrificed, and it decides, with a coldness indistinguishable from the very love it once was, that if it cannot have everything, then neither, in the end, can he. It is a symmetry the Greeks return to, again and again in their darkest stories, that the very devotion capable of the greatest sacrifice is also, when it is broken past any hope of repair, capable of the greatest ruin, and that the two are never as far apart in the human heart as we would like to believe. Rest now. Let this dark and difficult story settle quietly, the way the old tragedies always meant it to, not as a comfort, but as a warning carried gently across 3,000 years about the terrible symmetry between how completely we can love and how completely, when it is betrayed beyond repair, that same love can learn to destroy.
That's the story of Ellen's hidden hearth, a wall nobody understood until the cold made its case for her. If you want more real winter survival engineering like this every week, subscribe to The Hidden Hearth and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next story.